and welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
The team at the Research Works podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we live and work. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples, elders past and present, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast each week, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We recognise their continued connection to this beautiful budja we call home.
Hello everyone, I'm so glad you've decided to join us once again for another episode of the Research Works podcast.
Yes, welcome back everyone. Today we have a very special guest joining us, the fabulous Dr. Jessica Stokes-Parish. Welcome, Jessica.
Welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. We are really excited to talk to you today. I have actually been following you on social media for a little while now, and you know, the messages that you've been putting out, I think, resonate with me a lot and, you know, and resonate with what we're aiming to do on the podcast here about supporting people to make evidence-based decisions and make their practice more evidence-based. So we know that our listeners are really going to enjoy hearing from you today, Jessica.
It's so cool.
So for everyone listening, we're going to centre our conversation on Jessica's paper, which was published in 2022 in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, and that paper was titled Navigating the Credibility of Web-Based Information During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Using Mnemonics to Empower the Public to Spot Red Flags in Health Information on the Internet. Very topical.
It is, it is.
And, you know, while this article came out during the pandemic, there's obviously a whole lot of translation across the board when you consider the world of the internet and the role that social media plays in our lives now when we're talking about communicating science.
Yeah. So topical.
Yeah. Can't wait to get stuck in. But before we do that, let's tell our listeners a little bit more about Jessica. Jessica's a practicing intensive care nurse and educator with a Bachelor of Nursing, Masters in Nursing, Advanced Practice, Graduate Certificate in Critical Care Nursing and a PhD in Medicine from the University of Newcastle. Alongside her clinical work, Jessica is also a health professional workforce educator with a passion in science communication. As a health educator, researcher and clinician, Jessica truly believes that education should be accessible, and in 2022 published a paper that has her known, for better or worse, as the Crabs Lady. So we're going to unpack what that all means in the podcast today. And as we said, we're really excited to do that. That's kind of a formal getting to know you, Jessica, but we like to do an informal getting to know you as well. And our question today, which is quite topical and has been on my mind because we've had quite a few hot days here in Perth lately, is what's your favourite way to keep cool during the summer?
Definitely an ocean swim. Yeah, I mean, we've got it. The water's pretty warm up here on the Gold Coast as well. So,
how low is it? Yeah. You really got to spend some time in there to cool down.
How amazing is it you have that at your fingertips as well? We're so lucky to live in Australia. Certainly if you're living along the coastline.
On the coastline.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? It's so nice.
Yeah.
Look, I would love to agree with that. I'm just incredible. Like I don't mind the beach. I do find that, you know, sand annoys me a little bit, and I'm quite scared of sharks. And even though there's probably no sharks there, I just, you know, like I said last week, I think I shared that one of my cousins got me to watch Jaws when I was just 3 or 4 years old, and that just ruined it for me because at 4 years of age, you can't discern between what's normal. So whilst I would love to run down to the beach, I would have to say that going to the movies is probably one of my all-time favourite ways of keeping cool because you almost need to bring in a jumper or a sweater because it's so cold, right? And then you can have your little choc bomb and you can have your drink and then you just sit there and it's quite comfy.
Yes.
So it's very indoorsy, not particularly active, I acknowledge that.
Effective though.
But very effective.
Yeah.
And it doesn't cost me much because then you can, apart from a ticket, you don't have to worry about how much you're cranking it. You just sit there and you're like,
Yeah. Depends how much popcorn. And,
it's true. It's probably a
snacks
huge,
you buy.
It's probably a huge expenditure.
I do think the beach is probably more cost effective.
Yeah, I would agree. I might just need to get some help about this whole shark thing.
I do
might
like
be
that
okay.
you've tried to justify it, though.
I do.
Yeah. Like, it's not my air conditioning. So
It's someone else's air conditioning, but I paid for it, really.
Yeah.
What about you?
I think I'm with Jessica on a nice ocean dip. Our oceans here, or the ocean, this part of the ocean that we have here in Western Australia is probably a little bit cooler, so a little bit more refreshing. And I do like to follow that up with a nice kind of sorbet or really cold juice or some kind of cold drink.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, and it's a big business here because it gets really hot. Above 40 degrees is well known, and it can be a little bit tough. Well, I hope that helps prepare everyone for their summer, and I'll usually try to segue into what we're going to talk about. And, I guess there's a lot of things out there that you can buy, some potions to maybe help you cool down. I don't know, but you're going to have to wade your way through the information on the internet, and that's what we'll be talking about today.
I had crabs in my mind when I was talking about summer.
Oh, yes, you missed the opportunity.
I should have just gone for the crabs thing, but we're pulling people in about the crabs. What do we mean by crabs, and what has that got to do with misinformation? Here we go. Misinformation creates challenges for the general public, and we all know the challenge in differentiating between the truth from fiction when we're on the internet. This was particularly brought to the forefront recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw high volumes of news, ever-evolving information, changing, and of course, misinformation. But even beyond COVID-19, we know that if we are looking for information about anything for ourselves or our family and friends, we have to be able to somehow discern between reliable information and the not so. But if we're not experts in the area, how can we wade our way through the world of information?
We have an expert to guide us today, Jessica.
Indeed.
Let's start from the beginning. How did you find your way into this space of helping people discern between different types of information?
Yeah, look, I think to some degree, I fell into it in the sense of I'm a nurse. That's kind of my clinical background. And, I would get questions from my patients, or they would talk about things that they'd heard or seen about their health condition. And as a nurse, one of our primary jobs is interpreting information or trying to help guide people to find the right information. And then that really just compounded as I had my own children and as I spent more time online, and I began to see, I guess, overwhelming amounts of information that I was seeing was not right. And so that was kind of what started me on my journey of, well, I think I've got some value to add here. Maybe I can start kind of in this space.
Yeah, I love that.
And so cool.
I think we obviously all, as scientists and as health professionals, we all have a role to play in this. But can you talk to us a little bit about, I suppose, some of the definitions that we might be coming across when we're talking, within this area? What is misinformation and how is it different to, say, disinformation?
Yeah, sure. So misinformation is the inadvertent sharing of inaccurate or misleading information. And the thing that distinguishes it from disinformation is that disinformation has intent to cause harm.
Right.
So people share information that is inaccurate with the intent to cause harm, as opposed to misinformation, which is just you've seen something, it resonates with you, or you think, oh, that must be accurate because it's from somebody that you trust. You share it onwards without any sort of intent to harm or cause drama. It's just that you've shared it. And so that's the key distinction between the two.
Right.
Disinformation we see is something that is used politically and is used across a number of domains prior to kind of health because they want to cause unrest and confusion.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Wow. It's actually really good to be able to tease them out. There's, how we talk about communication, sometimes we say it's miscommunication, but sometimes it's just poor communication, and we can call that out sometimes and what it means and what's different. Jessica, I mean, I feel like we can all relate to this, but where do we tend to see misinformation? Where are the sources of that?
Yeah, look, so I'll just start by saying that most of the research around misinformation is from America and is focused on political misinformation and disinformation.
Right.
So that's where the field kind of started.
Right.
And over the last few decades, we've seen the shift to focusing on Australian-specific information about misinformation, and also we've begun to see it in the health space. So traditionally, when we look at research around misinformation, it has been in politics, but what we know about health misinformation is that it's largely around water safety and the cleanliness of water.
Right.
It's largely about infectious diseases. And it's also around some other diseases like, malaria or Zika virus or autism, autism not being a disease, but conditions that are polarizing or that people have ideological viewpoints about. That's where we see a lot of misinformation proliferate.
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting thing, isn't it? To see how it's shifted over.
Yeah. And it's...
Yes. Fascinating, isn't it?
It really is.
And it's not just, I think, quite, or more recently we think about misinformation and we think about social media and, because misinformation has the potential to spread quite quickly across social media. It's very accessible and it's very easy to share things using those platforms. But where are some of the other places where we might see misinformation?
Yeah, so definitely newspapers, physical paraphernalia. So when you look back at the literature around misinformation and disinformation around vaccines, for example, you can find documents from newspapers and notices in the community from the 1800s.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a really long history. And again, it comes back to worldview, personal values, and these different perceptions about natural versus unnatural and things like that. So it's quite fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, we definitely can see it on social media. There's another term that is worth bringing up, and that's fake news.
Yep.
So fake news is very different to misinformation and disinformation.
Okay. Right.
Because it's actually like somebody's created a fake news website that sends out disinformation.
Okay.
So fake news became very colloquial after the 2016 election.
Yes.
Because the presidential candidate at that time really weaponized the term fake news, but fake news really means fake news. Somebody's created something, Yeah.
And you can see how that, as you said, ties in quite closely to the political side of things, and you can see how disinformation is advantageous in that space, I suppose, to some people, depending on what they're trying to achieve. I think the misinformation part for me and how it relates to medical science and health science is really interesting. And I think just coming back to your point about newspaper articles, and I think news articles in general, I think it's happened to me previously. I've been interviewed for something on a particular topic, and the person who's been doing the story has, completely inadvertently maybe conflated a statistic or interpreted it incorrectly or, in a slightly different way, and that gets put out in the world and someone else could pick that up and share it, and then you can see how things start to evolve from there, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's where you've got to remember that the news, the purpose is, sure, they're sharing information, but it's also to generate, the more information they pump out, the more they're meeting their KPIs.
Yeah.
And so we've seen that with social media and digital news in particular, that there's less time for fact checking and more requests for more clickbait.
Yes.
And so we're in this unfortunate quandary now of, that the benefit of slow news has kind of been lost.
Yeah, because it has to be a hook, right? Like sometimes the right information isn't always the exciting information, or the...
Not something you can put together in just a soundbite sometimes. Yeah. And I think that challenge, it's so unfortunate that it's made its way to a wider area, I suppose, in health, because we now have so much information more than ever at our fingertips. We often talk about Dr. Google. You can put something in and you try to find some information. And I know that in your paper you do talk about this infodemic. What does this actually mean, and how does it relate to, I guess, trust and making informed decisions? I feel like sometimes there's a lot of information. Is it the right information? What does it all mean?
So infodemic is a relatively new term, and there's still a little bit of debate about what it means as it is in research land. But essentially it just means an overwhelming volume of information that kind of influences our cognitive processes, because if you're bombarded with this overwhelm of volume of information from all different angles and sides, how can you possibly navigate through that in any sort of meaningful way? And so again, it ties in with this idea of mis and disinformation, and that some of the information in an infodemic will be accurate.
Yes.
Some of it will be inaccurate, but inadvertently, and then sometimes it'll be inaccurate with intent to cause harm.
Gosh. And I know so many of families that I would work with, and sometimes I would say to them, look, don't look this up, because I know what sort of information you're going to see. An example might be a parent hears the word dystonia being given to them by their doctor. They might have thrown it out there going, there's the possibility. They look at what dystonia is, and all they see is images of the worst case scenario and go, oh my goodness, is this it? So there is this level of being able to discern, you might see extreme examples in this wealth of information that you find. And I know you refer to sort of the health literacy and digital literacy being something that we need to consider too. And I feel like that's something worth exploring in terms of just the language behind it too. Yeah. Can you just go to a bit of detail about what each of those are and why they're important to have that level of literacy?
Yeah, so there's a number of different types of literacy, as you've kind of outlined. We've got health literacy, we've got digital literacy, we've got media literacy.
Yeah.
And, the easiest way that I think to think about it is that we all have a level of knowledge and understanding about certain things.
Yep.
And that level of knowledge and understanding about that sub-area influences our ability to make judgments and decisions that affect us and those around us. So if we think about health literacy, it's, can somebody find the information that they need about health that's relevant to them? Do they have the ability to understand it and process it appropriately?
Yeah.
And then can they make a decision from it?
Right.
And so that then translates to this idea of digital literacy and media literacy as well. So does somebody have the physical and cognitive ability to navigate digital systems, to gather information, to process it for their situation, and then make a decision about it?
It's really interesting. And it makes my mind, and I don't know if this is a bit of a tangent or whether it's related to these concepts or not, but this role of confirmation bias, when we're looking at information that's put out there in the world. Can you talk about how confirmation bias whether it plays into these concepts of literacy or not, but how that also affects how we're processing information?
Yeah, definitely. So we all have a number of biases all the time. Even us three sitting here having a conversation, we have biases and cognitive processes that are going on as we're having this conversation, even to the fact of we're looking at each other and comparing how do we look to each other? Does that influence how much I like you or how much I can see myself in you? And so then that influences how I perceive you. So that's cognitive biases. There's many of them, but basically a cognitive bias is something that influences how we process the information that's in front of us and how we use that to influence it. So when it comes to confirmation bias, that basically says that our brain is constantly seeking or has a preference for finding information that confirms what we already believe. So this is influenced by our political worldview, our faith worldview, all of these different things that influence what we believe to be values or that we value about people, about the world, about life. We will seek information that confirms those beliefs. And so that's why it makes it so challenging that if you explore something that doesn't affirm your worldview, you may dismiss it as being inaccurate because your brain can't cope with the, clash.
That makes sense.
It does, doesn't it?
And you can see how it becomes quite cyclical in nature as well. You know, if you have your certain, radio stations or news channels or, places that you regularly go to seek information, they're feeding you a certain kind of information. So that feeds your confirmation bias.
It does. But it almost like, particularly when you're seeking information about something that's related to health, you may so easily miss things that are really relevant to you, don't they? And you just keep going down this path. What's the solution to that? Because that feels so internal, right? It's a very, if we're on our phones, what do you do apart from, being aware of it? What are some of the things that we can do? Because that's a little bit scary.
Yes, and I think, so you've highlighted the first piece, which is to be aware that biases exist and that, this particular one, confirmation bias, can really influence how we interpret and seek information. So after awareness comes having practical strategies to make sure that you're seeking a variety of perspectives and a variety of sources. So one of those might be that you internally realize that you have a perspective or a belief on a particular health issue. So then you need to then go and search out the opposite. So you go and look for, like, if it was to be, let's use, the example of dystonia. If you believe, that, it's going to be the worst case scenario. I can only get these treatments. I can only do this. Then you would go and seek the opposite information. So you would ask Google the opposite question.
That's such a good strategy.
So it's really tricky. I think I always recommend that you stop if you hear something that you go, oh yes, that makes so much sense. Wait, stop. Does it actually make sense? What evidence is there to support that? And what would support the opposite being true? And go and seek out information that would support that. This is where it becomes really tricky, right? Because with algorithms on social media,
I was just thinking
they amplify your confirmation bias because you curate your feeds, and rightly, there's reasons why you might curate your feed for your own mental well-being, but it means that it limits the other perspectives that you're seeing.
And you have to really actively seek that out because it's not being offered to you in any of the the places that you might frequent on those platforms. So
I think the other question that is good to ask is to interrogate why you think what you think. So, I've perceived to interpret this information as supporting this. Why do I think that?
What am I basing that on? And I think this leads us really nicely into the mnemonic that was developed as part of this paper that we're talking about, and why we referred to crabs earlier on in our introduction. So why don't you talk us through crabs, what it is, what each of those letters stand for, and then we can explore each of those elements in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, great. So as you mentioned, it's a mnemonic, and a mnemonic is basically just a cognitive shortcut to try and remember things easier. So I was seeing online these things that I was like, that's not quite accurate. But instead of constantly debunking information, we need a way to almost kind of shortcut or disrupt that. We need to get to it before it becomes something that needs debunking.
Yes.
And there is a term for that. It's called pre-bunking.
Ooh.
So there's a whole kind of field of research that's dedicated to pre-bunking and this idea that you can prepare people for misinformation that they're going to see.
Wow.
And it also moves a shift, right, to think about, if we think about health and digital literacy, it's a very deficit viewpoint. Like it's a very, you are lacking the information, so you need to do X, Y, and Z. So if we shift that narrative to a strengths-based approach,
we like that.
We can, we can think about, okay, we can't stop people from going online. We can't stop people from finding information that they actually need. So how do we work with people to help them think through what they're reading? And so the mnemonic was then developed as an easy way for people to remember, a systematic process for assessing the information that they're seeing.
I love that.
And so it's not designed to be, oh my gosh, if we see lots of red flags with this crabs mnemonic, we're going to throw out all the information. It's just that to slow your thinking down, to take a longer time to process the information and to train your brain to think more systematically is a really effective way of combating misinformation.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah.
I really do. So let's explore each of the elements now and go through what that means. And I think we can all start to think about how this relates and things we've seen online. And certainly, like we mentioned, we do follow you on social media, and you do go through this quite frequently and go, okay, well, let's just apply crabs, and you go through it. So that's really, really lovely. So the first one is C, which is conflict of interest. Talk to us about this. It's a big one.
Yeah. So I think for most people, when they think about conflict of interest, they think, money.
Yes.
And who's given you money to say this? We saw that all throughout the pandemic. You have that view, you must have been paid to say that. So there's this kind of financial conflict, which is always a potential. And we know that when we look at research papers as health professionals, we are looking to see who was this research sponsored by. If it was sponsored by somebody, did they have a vested interest and did they have any involvement in the research process? Which is a really important part of looking at research. But there's more than financial conflicts. There's also political conflicts. So it may be politically appropriate for this person to hold that view or to believe that perspective because it supports that. The other one, which I find really interesting, is the social benefit of holding that perspective. So what we saw during the pandemic is a really big influx of influencers who had no relevant experience, that was seemingly just arrived out of the ground, that suddenly had profiles of 50,000 followers. And so they often capitalized on misinformation and outrage so that they could generate the trust of the public and create this social capital.
Oh, my goodness.
And there's a lot of evidence around this, actually, that people do this kind of stuff because they want to create this pseudo-social standing, and that they need a controversial topic to focus on. Otherwise, no one comes to them for any sort of information. You can see the confirmation bias aspect that kind of plays into
100%.
that, right?
Yeah.
And from their perspective, is there a downstream effect for that? Like, is that the stimulus to get people following their profile and listening to them, so then there's some kind of financial benefit to them down the track? Is that
typically yes?
Yeah.
Typically they'll have codes, affiliate marketing. You're selling a supplement, or they want to go run for politics. So those kinds of things. And so the other part of conflict of interest is interrogating your biases, which we've kind of talked about a little bit already, is understanding what bias might influence this perspective. And so we see this a lot with biases around like the appeal to nature fallacy. So where you have a kind of inherent belief that anything that's natural is better.
Yes.
Or you might have a perspective that doctors just want to take control of your body, so therefore any sort of intervention is bad. And so it's there's often elements of truth, like there's a reason why people have come to this belief. But that's also, those biases are a conflict in why this person might hold that position.
It's so, as you're talking about a lot of that, I can't help but to go back to when we're trying to publish an article, like we all know what that's like. And, we try to, these days when you try to put in an article, it's definitely more involved now. When you have to fill out your conflict of interest section, it's so much bigger. There's such a focus on it. And when you talk about biases, when we're evaluating research, we're always just trying to find if there's a bias somewhere, and there's this really rigorous process for it.
Yeah, and I think, qualitative research as well, often that's something that you build into your paper, a discussion of your perspective and your biases and how you might have arrived at the conclusions you arrive at because of this perspective that you hold.
Absolutely.
And there's such a process now in research for us to follow that. So you can imagine in the uncurated world of information going out, and you remove that element that is making us stop. That rigor, then you can see what can happen from there. Okay, that's a good one.
Let's move to R, references. So what... And again, with a scientific paper, you have a big reference list at the back to all of the evidence that contributes to the work you have published. But when we're talking about references within the Crabs mnemonic, what are we referring to?
Yeah. So, firstly, is there any references there to support what this person is saying? Number one. Number two, does the reference actually exist?
Yes.
So what we've begun to see online is that people just make up stuff because it suits their narrative. So you want to look up, does this reference actually exist? And so this does, I push back at a lot of health professionals that are on social media and scientists and say, you really shouldn't be making a post without adding references to it, and you really need to do your due diligence of making sure they're there.
It's like any kind of presentation, isn't it? If you're doing a presentation, it's not enough to just stick some words on a slide and say, this is right. Trust me.
Exactly. So the other thing is how recent is the publication? So is it 20 years old or is it within the last 5 years? Because again, one of the telltale signs for me is that when you are online and you're looking at information, if they reference something from the 1960s, then, science has probably moved on a little bit from there.
I feel like I feel like the talk around autism and vaccinations and the link between the two is maybe a nice example of that. Could you explain that a little bit more for our listeners?
So in the 1980s, a scientist, a doctor, fabricated some data and published a paper that basically said there was a link between a gene affected from the vaccine that caused autism. Now, there was so many issues with this paper in that it was tissue samples, there was no analysis that was relevant, and then it turned out that he basically made it up. So that's triggered decades of research to prove that this false piece of information, this fraudulent piece of information was inaccurate.
Yeah.
So there's been a real cost, but people will cite that original paper, even though it's been retracted, people will continue to use that as a reference. So,
Wow.
yeah. And other things that I think about is, predatory journals.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a lot of misinformation in predatory journals because it's like a paper mill, and so anyone can just pay money and publish anything they want, and they don't have quality checks, they don't have peer review. It's a very rapid publication process, and what you'll find is that misinformation that does have references will often cite papers from really questionable journals.
Wow.
So, I think that's an important one for our listeners who are involved in research as well. What are some of the red flags that might indicate that a journal is a predatory journal?
One, if they email you and ask you to publish something, that's number one.
Yep.
It'll often be like, "Dear esteemed professor," or something very flowery.
Yeah.
So that's red flag number one. Red flag number two is that they promise really rapid publishing time and turnaround. So you could submit your work and have it published within a week.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Number three, they ask for a significant fee. Number four, the websites are often really poor quality, and when you go through the editorial board, none of the people have relevant expertise. So you kind of got to go through that list and see, is this anyone that I know from my field of research?
Yeah.
Would they be considered? So they would be the red flags. There's also a list out there if you look up Beale's predatory journal list. There was a librarian who dedicated their career to collating and compiling lists of possible and actual predatory journals.
That is
I love
amazing.
Yeah. He disappeared off the face of the earth after some time.
Okay.
Basically just went AWOL. I think there would have been some threats and things like that.
Yeah.
But somebody else is now hosting that list. But if you look that up, you can find a list of journals that are considered to be predatory.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Well, the next one from references, which I feel like I could talk about for ages because I think I'm really passionate about references. But author is another one that's a really big one. Please talk to us about that.
Yeah. So, with social media, the good and the bad is that anyone can say anything and they can write whatever they like because, it's just their opinion.
Yeah.
But what I say about this is, find out about the author. Who are they?
Yeah.
What's their real name? Do they have a real name, or are they online as a pseudonym or anonymous?
Sure.
So look, because there's quite a few people that they're not real, like they're fake.
Interesting.
Or they have misleading credentials about themselves. So there was a, you're going to love this. I don't know if you saw this in the news last week, but there was a Bachelor of Health Sciences student in Sydney who pretended to be an obstetrics and gynecology registrar on TikTok for a long time.
Oh, wow.
And basically what they say happened was somebody mistook them for a doctor one day and they decided that they would just carry on with that they created a whole account. They had sponsorships. They were sharing educational information. They got a job.
Oh, no.
As somebody, yep.
Wow.
I know, we need a moment,
shocking.
right?
Yeah, I feel like I'm processing that. What on earth? The confidence to even continue to go down that path is alarming,
it's baffling.
but it's so dangerous. We can all see how dangerous this is.
I know. So my thing is don't actually believe people who are who they say they are.
Yeah. Especially on TikTok.
Sometimes I sit here and I think I'm becoming more and more of a pessimist every day. I sit here and think, I don't believe anyone is real. You're just a figment of my imagination. Can't believe anyone or anything. So go Google them.
Yeah.
Look for their name on the register of practitioners. If they're saying they're a health practitioner, go on AHPRA and look up their name.
Yeah.
Make sure that they're real.
Yeah.
Go on LinkedIn, see if you can find them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to the author, like, do they actually have the relevant, expertise? If all of their topics are talking about, nutrition or whatever, what kind of nutrition degree do they have?
Yeah.
Is it a 6-week online course that's not registered with any training organisation, or is it a Bachelor of Nutrition or a Master's of Nutrition and Dietetics? There's so much variation, all that. So look at their training, their quals, what additional credentials they might have.
And I apologise for not going through the crabs in order at this point, but I feel like that ties in really nicely to the S in crabs, which is scope of practice. So can we just talk about, now that we're kind of on that train, can we just talk about that a little bit as well?
Yeah, so this one is there's normally one of two things that you see. You see somebody who's really junior who overstates their expertise, so they're a new grad and they misrepresent themselves as being like a really advanced kind of clinician. Or, they're a PhD student and they represent themselves as being somebody that's researched for a really long time. So that's one part of overstepping scope of practice. The second part is when they use their credentials in one area to create an appeal to authority in another area. So really good example is like somebody who works in some sort of engineering, mechanical engineering, then moves across into nutritional chemistry.
Right.
And they kind of use their qualifications from their previous degree to highlight that they're qualified and they're, again, it's this appeal to authority. It's this perception of, so I always, how long have they been practicing for?
Yes.
How long have they had this specialty expertise? Have they actually done the clinical work, or did they just do 1 year and then went to casual and have done an occasional shift? There's a lot of that happens online. A lot of health practitioners who have they've done a year's worth of work and then they've stopped, but they still use their traiing to kind of infer expertise.
And I suppose by that point as well, they have enough of the language and the enough understanding to be able to build that platform, don't they?
To sell it in that way.
And I think it's just it's a grey area and it's a fine line, because you don't want to gatekeep and say you don't want to do educational content, but if you kind of over refer to your actual expertise, then it becomes a bit concerning.
For sure.
And I think, the takeaway there is to try not to take everything at face value, dig a little deeper and just have a really good understanding of who that person is and what they are qualified to speak on before you make decisions about the kind of information that they're providing you.
Yeah, and that information is available online. We can find this information because it is available. So dig a little bit deeper. Yeah. Well, the last one is B for Buzzwords.
Yeah,
I love this one. Please talk to us about Buzzwords.
So when I actually submitted this, the peer reviewers really pushed back on this term. They were like, Buzzwords, and I was like, no, this is like,
it's real.
This is marketing, emotional, So it's the buzzword is, the use of some sort of language to pull you in or to trigger an emotive response. Or you think about like greenwashing, for example. Like that's sustainability is a buzzword.
Organic
that is used in marketing. Organic. It's a buzzword that's used in marketing to evoke a certain response in you so that you trust it or you feel disgusted. Like fear. Lots of fear-based narratives, so like toxins, or toxic, those kinds of things are buzzwords to make you think, ooh, danger. And they really kind of trigger an emotional response, and emotions hijack your ability to think critically. So it's really important to kind of think about it. The types of language, the use of music, or even we're seeing in some policy like emojis are really perceived to be kind of part of this buzzword aspect too.
I think, when you talk about the emotive music and things like that, I think that plays into a lot of the misinformation that we see
100%.
in our
Yeah.
kind of
we
area of practice and research. Yeah, for sure.
And it's all very manipulative in that way because emotions are so powerful. And when we're in the area of child health and you're a parent, you want to do something great for your child, and there's this really emotional music that comes along.
Of course.
It's a tough one. Like, what are you meant to do, you know? And I love how also in your paper you relate to, and we can relate to that. As researchers, we're trained not to overstate things, which is whereas people who are very confident but don't actually have the skills behind it are very okay to say, this cures. Yeah. This is a 100%, where we're going like, there's probability and there's variance and we, you can't compete.
We use so many hedges in all of our clinical writing and research. And so it's really hard because it's such a polar opposite to the reality of digital climate.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jessica, where to from here? I love if you had any, aside from the crabs mnemonic, which I think is so helpful and hopefully is a big takeaway for everyone listening today, what's next for you and this work?
Yeah, look, I think for me it's about formalising educational opportunities around science communication for health professionals and scientists. Yeah. We've seen a lot of focus on training around social media and modalities, but I think there's a real missed opportunity to train health professionals and scientists on the theory and application of science communication. Yeah. We have a lot of focus in health professions degrees about health communication and how do we talk. Yeah. But, the distinction there is that that's a therapeutic relationship. Yes. Yeah. And a therapeutic relationship is very different to communicating to the public or to other people when you don't have that kind of therapeutic interaction. Yeah. So I think we need to see a bit of a shift in that space. And I'm hopeful that I'll kind of be moving into that in the next couple of years. And I think I need to do a bit better job of getting crabs out there a little bit more in health services and opportunities like that. So
yeah, it's such exciting work and so helpful on so many levels. And I think this is just the start of a really huge body of work. And we hope that you'll come back and talk to us again about the next steps of this work as they come out. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you guys. It's been a great convo.
Oh, I loved it. You're definitely the right person to champion it, and we're right there to support you. We're just really grateful for your time. So we do encourage people to have a look at your Instagram as well, and you've got a website. There's a lot of great links there which will pop onto our website, so researchworks.net, where you can find all those links to the paper in particular, but also to Jessica. And there's a CPD form there as well you can fill out to keep this as part of a record of your PD requirements. But for now, thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
And we'll talk to everyone again very soon. See you later, everyone.
Thanks, Jessica.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.